3 days before my son's retirement party, I walked into Henderson's dry cleaning on Elgin Street to pick up the blazer I planned to wear. I'd been bringing my clothes there for 22 years. Margaret Henderson, the owner, met me at the counter with a face I didn't recognize. Not the warm, easy face of a woman who'd hemmed my trousers and ironed my husband's shirts since 1998. This was a face drawn tight, with something she was carrying alone. She didn't say hello. She leaned across the counter and said quietly, "Eleanor, come to the back. Now." I almost laughed. Almost said, "I just need the blazer, Margaret." But her hands were trembling against the glass counter, and I have known this woman long enough to know she does not tremble. I followed her through the narrow hallway behind the pressing machines, past the chemical smell of dry cleaning fluid and warm steam, into the small office where she kept her ledger books and the electric kettle she used to make tea when the day went long. She closed the door. She did not offer tea. "Someone was in here yesterday," she said. "2 of them. They used my consultation room next door, the one I rent to the alterations lady on Tuesdays. They didn't know I was still here. I was working late, doing the end-of-month accounts." She looked at me directly. "Eleanor, I heard your son's name. I heard your name. I heard numbers I don't think you're supposed to know about yet. I'm going to tell you what I did in the next 48 hours. But first, I need you to understand who I am. Because this story isn't just about fraud and lawyers and frozen accounts. It's about a woman who spent 40 years building something and almost lost it the one time she forgot to pay attention to the people inside her own walls. My name is Eleanor Marsh. I'm 64 years old. I live in Ottawa, Ontario, in the house on Fairmont Avenue that my husband Gerald and I bought in 1991, the year our son Daniel was born. Gerald died 9 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, swift and merciless. He was 56. After he died, I did what I had always done. I worked. We had built Marsh Environmental Consulting together over 17 years, a firm that helped municipalities, developers, and federal contractors navigate environmental assessment under Canadian law. Gerald was the scientist. I was the strategist, the one who read the room, who knew which city councillor needed reassuring and which deputy minister needed firm language. When Gerald died, I ran the firm alone. I had no choice. We had 11 employees and 4 active contracts with Natural Resources Canada. I could not afford to stop. I didn't stop. In 9 years, I grew revenue from $2.8 million to $7.1 million annually. I brought in a federal infrastructure account worth $900,000 a year. I rebuilt our analytical team. I mentored 3 junior consultants who are now senior staff. I did all of this from a home office on Fairmont Avenue, from a firm whose name still carried Gerald's in it, from a woman who ate dinner alone most nights and answered emails at midnight. Daniel graduated from Queen's with a business degree in 2015. He joined the firm in 2016. He was good. Better than I expected, frankly, because I had never pushed him and he had found his way on his own. By 2019, he was managing our provincial contracts. By 2022, he had the title of Vice President of Operations. I was genuinely proud of him. Then Natasha arrived. She came as a financial consultant in January of 2023. Daniel brought her in to review our billing systems. She had a degree from Western, 8 years at an accounting firm in Toronto, and a manner that I can only describe as precise. Every word she chose was the right word for the situation. Every number she presented was exactly as clean as it needed to be. I hired her as our Director of Finance in March. By May, she and Daniel were seeing each other. By the following spring, engaged. I told myself I was happy for him. I told myself I was. The party was Daniel's idea. He called it a celebration of the firm's 25th anniversary, not my retirement, though that is what it was. He had been suggesting, gently at first and then less gently, that I step back. Take more time for yourself, Mom. You've earned it. You've been running at this pace since Dad died. At some point, you have to rest. He was right that I was tired. He was wrong about what I needed. The party was scheduled for a Saturday evening at the Brook Street Hotel in Canada. 80 guests, a catered dinner, a brief program of remarks. I had approved the venue, the guest list, the menu. I had bought the blazer specifically for that night. which is why I was standing in Henderson's dry cleaning on a Wednesday afternoon when Margaret Henderson pulled me into her back office and told me she had heard something she could not keep to herself. She told me what she had heard: the names, the numbers, the outline of an arrangement. I stood in that small office for a long time without speaking. Outside, a car passed on Elgin Street. The pressing machine clicked and released. Margaret poured water into the kettle without asking me. I took the cup she handed me and I said, "Tell me exactly what you heard. Every word." She did. When she finished, I set down the cup. I took my blazer from the hook by the door. I thanked her. I walked out to my car, and I sat in the parking lot on Elgin Street, and I did not start the engine for 31 minutes. What Margaret had overheard, through the thin wall of a shared consultation room, was a meeting between two people. One was a man named Philip Archer. He was an estate lawyer I had never hired, though I knew his name from the professional circles in Ottawa. The second voice Margaret recognized but couldn't place immediately. It was only when she heard the names Marsh Environmental and Eleanor specifically that she understood. The second voice was Daniel's. They had been discussing a consent to act as substitute decision-maker under the Ontario Substitute Decisions Act, a document that, if signed and accepted, would give Daniel legal authority over my financial and property decisions in the event that a designated assessor determined I lacked capacity to manage those decisions myself. Philip Archer had apparently said that once the documentation was in place, the transfer of the firm's voting shares could be structured as a health protective measure rather than a commercial transaction, which would have significant implications for capital gains treatment and would bypass the usual consent requirements in our shareholder agreement. The transfer they were discussing was not 30%. It was the whole firm. I knew enough about Ontario estate law to understand what I was hearing. The Substitute Decisions Act exists to protect vulnerable people. It is used every day by families helping aging parents who genuinely cannot manage their own affairs. Used ethically, it is a vital piece of legislation. Used the way Philip Archer apparently intended, it is a mechanism to strip a competent woman of everything she owns. But I needed to know more before I did anything. I drove to Catherine Osei's office on Bank Street. Catherine had been my corporate lawyer for 14 years. She had drafted every major contract the firm had signed, every partnership agreement, every amendment to our shareholder structure. Her assistant had left for the day, but Catherine was still at her desk when I knocked. She looked at my face and said, "Sit down." I told her what Margaret had told me. Catherine listened without interrupting, which is how I know she understood the gravity. Normally, she asks clarifying questions constantly. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she turned to her screen. Under the SDA, she said, a capacity assessment has to come from a designated assessor, usually a doctor, sometimes a social worker with specific credentials. If someone has already filed for or initiated a capacity assessment process, there may be a record. She typed for a moment. I can check the Consent and Capacity Board registry first thing tomorrow. But Eleanor, if what you heard is accurate, this is not Daniel acting alone. I know, I said. Who else knows your medical history? Your current doctor? My physician was Dr. Renata Kowalski, a family doctor I had seen for 11 years at a clinic on Merivale Road. I went home and opened my laptop. I did not sleep. I searched Philip Archer's firm, Archer and Vance, and found his practice history, corporate estate planning, business succession, family trusts. He had a clean record with the Law Society of Ontario, nothing obvious. I searched the connection between Archer and Vance and Natasha's former employer, the Toronto accounting firm where she had worked for 8 years. At midnight, I found it, a single cross-reference in a 2021 Law Society continuing education brochure. Philip Archer had co-presented a session titled Succession Planning in Owner-Managed Firms alongside a senior partner from that Toronto accounting firm, the same firm where Natasha had spent 8 years. It could be coincidence. I did not believe it was coincidence. At 7 a.m, I called Frank Arsenault. Frank had been a fraud investigator with the RCMP Commercial Crime Section for 20 years before retiring to run a private practice in Nepean. I had been introduced to him 4 years earlier through a client who had needed his services on a contractor fraud case. He was methodical, discreet, and he answered his phone early. I told him what I needed. He said he could have a preliminary picture in 36 hours. He also said, "Your son. Do you want me to look at him the same way I'd look at the others?" I paused. "Yes," I said, "the same way." The next 36 hours, I kept my routine exactly. I went to the office on Thursday morning. I reviewed a draft environmental impact report for a client in Sudbury. I attended a 1 o'clock call with our Natural Resources Canada contact. I said good morning to Daniel when he arrived at 9 and asked him whether the audiovisual setup at Brook Street had been confirmed for Saturday. He said it had. He was relaxed. He smiled easily. I smiled back. At 2 o'clock, I called Dr. Kowalski's clinic and asked to speak with the office manager about accessing my records. I did not explain why. I simply requested a complete copy of my clinical file under the Personal Health Information Protection Act. The office manager told me it would take 3 to 5 business days. I said I needed it urgently and cited my rights under PHIPAA. She said she would speak with the doctor. 40 minutes later, Dr. Kowalski called me herself. She sounded careful. "Eleanor, I want to be straightforward with you. A request came to this office 6 weeks ago. It was framed as a routine pre-assessment information request. It came through a form I didn't review personally. My admin processed it." "A request for what?" A short silence. "For a summary of any documented cognitive or neurological concerns from the past 3 years, to be provided to a designated assessor." The assessor's name, when she gave it, was a registered social worker named Dr. Alan Firth, who held capacity assessment credentials through the Consent and Capacity Board of Ontario. I wrote it down. "Renata," I said quietly, "was there anything in my file that could support a finding of reduced capacity?" She was firm. "Absolutely not. You are in excellent health. Your cognitive function has been entirely normal at every visit. There is nothing in your file that would support that conclusion. Would you be willing to say that formally, if it came to that?" She did not hesitate. "Yes." I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat in my car in the clinic parking lot and made 2 more calls, one to Catherine, one to Frank. Frank called me back at 9 o'clock that night with his first findings. He had traced Natasha's professional history more carefully than her LinkedIn profile presented it. The 8 years at the Toronto firm were real. What was not on her profile was a civil matter from 2020 filed in Toronto, in which a client alleged that Natasha had structured a business transfer that removed the client's elderly father from his own company's ownership without his informed understanding. The matter had been settled. Records were sealed. But Frank had a contact who knew the details. The settlement had been $250,000. The pattern was not new. Frank also found that Philip Archer had done estate restructuring work for at least 2 clients in the past 4 years, where the original business owner had been assessed for capacity within months of engaging Archer's firm. In one case, the owner, a 71-year-old woman who ran a printing company in Kingston, had been declared incapable, and control of her business transferred to her adult children via a continuing power of attorney for property. The business was sold 8 months later. The woman was now in a long-term care facility in Brockville. I asked Frank her name. He told me. I wrote it down. I called Catherine at 10 o'clock that night, and we talked for an hour. Saturday was 36 hours away. I want to tell you something about the night before the party, because I think it matters. I sat in the kitchen on Fairmont Avenue, the house where Daniel had grown up, where Gerald had made coffee every morning and left the mugs in the wrong cabinet, where I had worked and eaten and grieved and built. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold, and I looked at the photograph on the refrigerator that has been there since 2009. It was taken at Daniel's university graduation, the year before Gerald got sick. The 3 of us at Confederation Park, Gerald's arm around my shoulders, Daniel in his convocation gown, all of us squinting into the May sun. I thought about how Gerald would handle this. Gerald would have said, "Get your evidence, Eleanor. Don't move until you're sure, and then don't flinch." I did not flinch. Saturday morning arrived cold and bright. That particular October clarity that Ottawa gets when the leaves have mostly gone and the air has something crystalline in it. I dressed carefully. The blazer, a dark charcoal, pressed exactly as I had wanted it. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. At noon, Catherine came to Fairmont Avenue. Frank arrived 20 minutes later. My senior project director, a man named Stephen Gould, who had been with the firm for 12 years and who had been quietly appalled by what I'd told him in a sealed conversation the day before, arrived at 12:30. The four of us sat in Gerald's old study and went over everything. The plan was not theatrical. I am not a theatrical person. But some things need to be witnessed. The party began at 6. The Brook Street Hotel was warm and lit well, the kind of room that makes a crowd look more important than it is. 80 guests, a mixture of clients, colleagues, government contacts, a few old friends. Daniel stood near the entrance, greeting people. Natasha was beside him, elegant and composed. I arrived at 6:15, spoke to the hotel events manager for 2 minutes, then found my seat. At 7:30, Daniel took the microphone. He gave a speech. It was, I have to admit, a well-constructed speech. He talked about the firm Gerald and I had founded, about watching me work after his father died, about what it meant to carry something forward. He said I had taught him that detail mattered, that integrity was not a strategy but a baseline. He looked at me when he said it. I thought about the sealed consultation room on Elgin Street. He raised his glass and said, "To my mother, Eleanor Marsh, the most capable person I have ever known." The room raised their glasses. I stood up. The room quieted, assuming I would give the traditional maternal response, a brief, warm acknowledgement, a toast to the future, a graceful handoff. That is what the program listed. I thanked Daniel for his words. I said the last 25 years had been built on something I would never stop being grateful for, which was the trust of the people in this room. I said trust was something you earned in small increments and could lose in a single decision. Then I said, before I continue, I'd like to share something with this room, because many of you are clients, colleagues, and people who deserve to know what has been happening inside this firm. The room shifted. I nodded to Stephen, who was standing near the AV console at the back. A screen descended behind me. I turned back to the room. 3 weeks ago, a request was submitted to my physician's office for a summary of cognitive and neurological concerns in my clinical file. It was framed as a routine pre-assessment intake. It was submitted without my knowledge. I paused. The room was very still. The request was connected to a process initiated under the Ontario Substitute Decisions Act, a process designed to have me assessed for legal incapacity. A process which, if completed, would have allowed a transfer of my voting shares in Marsh Environmental Consulting under a health protective framework, bypassing the consent requirements in our shareholder agreement. I heard someone exhale sharply at a table to my left. This is the document that describes that framework. The screen showed a scanned copy of a draft legal memorandum on Archer and Vance letterhead. I did not read it aloud. I let the room read it. 2 of our longest-standing clients, a senior director at the National Capital Commission and the founder of a civil engineering firm we had partnered with for a decade, leaned forward at their tables. They knew enough about corporate law to understand exactly what they were looking at. The firm involved in preparing this framework, I said, is Archer and Vance, an Ottawa estate law practice. The assessor identified to conduct the capacity evaluation is a registered social worker named Dr. Alan Firth. I clicked to the next slide. It showed a timeline, 3 cases, different names, the same structure. Capacity assessment, power of attorney for property, business transfer, long-term care placement. This is not the first time this approach has been used. In the past 4 years, at least 2 other business owners in Ontario have been subjected to a near-identical structure. One of them was a woman named Patricia Ng, age 71, who ran a printing company in Kingston. Patricia was assessed, declared incapable, and her company was sold within 8 months. She is currently a resident of a long-term care facility in Brockville. She is 73 years old, and she has not been back to her business since. I paused. Patricia agreed to participate tonight. She is watching this event by video. Stephen pressed a key. A live video feed appeared on the screen. Patricia Ng sat in a small, tidy room, a cardigan over her shoulders, her hands folded in her lap. She was 73 and she looked it, but her eyes were sharp. "My name is Patricia Ng," she said. In 2021, a lawyer told my son that I was showing signs of confusion and that we should get ahead of it legally. My son believed him. I believed my son. I signed documents I didn't read carefully because I trusted my family. 14 months later, I was in Brockville. The company I had built for 30 years was sold. My son received the proceeds. I saw none of it. She paused. I am telling you this because Eleanor Marsh called me last week and told me what was happening to her. I want you to know it can happen to anyone. I want you to know that it happened to me. The feed ended. The room was silent in a way I have only experienced twice before. Once at Gerald's funeral. Once at a tribunal where a client faced a regulatory decision that would end his career. I turned back to the room. My physician, Dr. Renata Kowalski, has confirmed in a written statement that there is no clinical basis for a capacity assessment in my case. A copy of that statement has been filed with the Consent and Capacity Board of Ontario and with the Law Society of Ontario as of this morning. I looked out at the guests. There is also a matter of our firm's financial records. The next slide appeared. It showed a corporate filing, a numbered company registered in Ontario in February of that year. I did not read the shareholder names aloud. I let the room see them. Then I looked at Natasha. This company was incorporated 8 months ago. 2 of its shareholders are people in this room tonight. Natasha's face did not move. She was very good. Between March and September of this year, 3 of our federal contracts were subject to what appears to be deliberate mismanagement. Deliverables were delayed without cause. Internal communications were not forwarded to clients. In one case, a key report was submitted with errors that our Natural Resources Canada contact flagged directly to me, errors that should never have passed internal review. I paused. These errors cost us 1 contract renewal and damaged 2 client relationships that took a decade to build. I looked at the NCC director at his table. Paul, you emailed me in August. You said communication from our team had become inconsistent and you were reconsidering your engagement. I told you I was looking into it. I have now looked into it. Paul nodded slowly. The pattern was designed to make the firm appear to be declining under my leadership. To support a narrative that I was losing my edge, that succession was urgent, that a health protective transfer was necessary and timely, I folded my hands. It was not a coincidence. It was a strategy. I heard a chair scrape. Philip Archer, who had been seated at a table near the back as a guest of Daniel's, stood up and moved toward the exit. 2 men in dark blazers stepped in front of the door. They were not hotel staff. I kept my eyes on the room. Effective as of 9 o'clock this evening, an emergency order has been granted by the Ontario Superior Court of Justice, freezing all transfers relating to Marsh Environmental Consulting's shares and assets. The order was filed by my counsel, Catherine Osei of Osei Law, and was granted this afternoon. Catherine stood from her table and held up the filing. 2 officers of the Ontario Provincial Police will now proceed. I ask the room to remain seated. The officer who approached Philip Archer did so quietly. Archer said nothing. He looked at the floor. Daniel stood up. He was not in handcuffs. He was not going to be that night. What I had told the OPP, and what Catherine had confirmed in her filing, was that the evidence suggested Daniel had been a participant in the planning, but that the full nature of his understanding and intent was still under investigation. He would not be arrested at his own engagement party. That was a line I had drawn deliberately, and Catherine had respected it. But he needed to know what I knew. He needed to know it here, in front of the people we had both served. Daniel, I said. He looked at me from across the room. I love you. I have loved you since the moment you were born. I named you after your grandfather because I wanted you to know from the first day of your life that you came from people who built things and took care of them. I kept my voice steady. I do not know everything you knew or didn't know. I know what you signed. I know what you planned. I know that you sat in Margaret Henderson's consultation room on a Tuesday afternoon and discussed transferring this firm out of my hands without my knowledge or consent. The room was very quiet. Whatever Natasha told you, whatever Philip Archer assured you, whatever you told yourself about protecting me, you have to live with that now. And so do I. I stepped back from the microphone. The next hour was something I could not have managed without Stephen and Catherine and Frank, who coordinated everything while I stood near the window, looking out at the parking lot and the dark October sky. Guests left in stages. Some stopped to speak to me. Most couldn't. The NCC director shook my hand without a word and held it for a moment longer than necessary. Natasha left with the OPP investigator for a formal statement. She did not look at me on the way out. Daniel sat alone at his table until the room was almost empty. Rosa, the hotel event supervisor who had been quietly watching all evening, brought him a glass of water without being asked. Small kindnesses from strangers. I have noticed they often come from the people no one thinks to notice. I walked to his table. He looked up. His face was a complicated thing. Not the face I had expected, not defiance, not calculation, something younger than that. "I thought you were tired," he said. "I thought you'd be relieved." I sat down across from him. "I know. Natasha said you'd been making errors. She showed me examples. She said, Caldwell." He stopped. "Dr. Firth." She said, "Dr. Firth would confirm it. She said it was the kindest way." Did you believe her? He looked at his hands. "I wanted the firm. I'm not going to lie to you and say I didn't. I've been in your shadow my entire career and I wanted it to be mine. Natasha gave me a way to justify that. And he stopped. I let her." I looked at my son across the white tablecloth, surrounded by the wreckage of a party meant to celebrate everything we had built together. "You need to speak to a lawyer," I said. "Not Philip Archer. Someone independent. Tomorrow morning." He nodded. "And then we are going to have a very long conversation about what comes next. Not tonight." We sat there for a while in the empty room, the two of us. I thought about Gerald's photograph on the refrigerator. I thought about the oak tree we had planted in the backyard when Daniel was born, which had grown considerably taller than anyone expected. I thought about all the things you build and cannot protect entirely, no matter how carefully you work. I did not cry until I was in the car. The months that followed were not easy, and I am not going to pretend they were. Philip Archer surrendered his certificate of authorization to the Law Society of Ontario in December, following a complaint filed by Catherine and supported by the OPP investigation. A Law Society hearing was scheduled for the following spring. The numbered company was dissolved by court order. The emergency injunction became a permanent protective order over Marsh Environmental Consulting's ownership structure. Natasha was not charged criminally. The investigation determined that her conduct, while clearly unethical and potentially actionable in civil proceedings, did not meet the criminal threshold under the Criminal Code of Canada. A civil claim was filed by Catherine on my behalf in January. That matter is ongoing. Daniel was interviewed by the OPP twice. He was not charged. The investigators determined he had been manipulated into participating in a process whose full implications he had not understood, though his willingness to participate without asking harder questions remained a matter I could not simply set aside. He resigned from Marsh Environmental Consulting in November. He repaid his signing bonus and returned the discretionary shares that had been issued to him in 2022. He moved to a consulting position with a different firm in Gatineau. We spoke occasionally at first, short calls, careful and formal, then less formal. Then, by March, something that sounded more like us. My physician, Dr. Kowalski, submitted a formal complaint to the Ontario Health Professions Regulatory Body about the unauthorized information request that had been processed by her office. That process resulted in a policy review at her clinic and a formal letter of caution issued to the practice manager. Patricia Ng's case was reviewed following the public attention generated by the OPP investigation. Her son retained separate counsel and is now the subject of a capacity review proceeding of his own, initiated by an adult protection worker in the Brockville region. Patricia called me in February from her long-term care facility. She said she was cautiously hopeful. I told her to hold on to that. Cautious hope is still hope. I had my own cognitive assessment done in January, voluntarily, through the Bruyere Memory Clinic on Carling Avenue. The neuropsychologist who saw me, a precise woman named Dr. Amara Singh, spent 2 full days on her evaluation. Her report concluded, among other things, that my working memory, executive function, and processing speed placed me in the 89th percentile for my age cohort. She told me, at the end of our second session, that I was sharper than most of her colleagues. I thanked her. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired, and I felt glad, and I felt Gerald's absence the way I always feel it, which is like a room you walk into that used to be full of furniture and now has only light. I did not do press. Not a single interview. The story circulated in Ottawa legal and business circles, which is a small world, and that was enough. 3 people called me in the months that followed to say they had been approached in similar ways and had not known what they were looking at. I spoke to each of them for as long as they needed. That felt more useful than an interview. I am still running Marsh Environmental Consulting. Stephen Gould is now our Vice President of Operations. He was the right choice, and I should have seen it sooner. We rebuilt the 2 federal relationships that had been damaged. The NRC contract was renewed in February at a higher value than the previous term. Paul from the National Capital Commission called me in April and said he was recommending our firm for a new assessment initiative. I thanked him. Then I closed my office door and allowed myself 5 minutes of something that was not quite crying and not quite relief but lived somewhere between the two. On a Thursday morning in April, 6 months after the party at Brook Street, I was in the kitchen on Fairmont Avenue when a text message came from Daniel. "Mom, I know this is early. I'm in Ottawa today. Can I come by?" I looked at the message for a long time. Outside, the oak tree in the backyard was starting to bud. It does this every year. Reliably and without announcement, the way some things simply continue regardless of what happens around them. I typed back, "Come for lunch. I'll make soup." He arrived at noon. He looked older. Not in a bad way. More considered, somehow. The way grief makes people more considered when they let it. We ate at the kitchen table, the same table where I had sat 2 nights before the Brook Street party, and we talked for 3 hours. Not about the firm, about Gerald, about his childhood, about the things he had felt and not said, and the things I had given and not given. At some point he said, "I wanted you to see me." I set down my spoon. "I know," I said. I didn't look carefully enough. I was so focused on what I was building that I didn't notice what was missing between us. "Derek," I stopped. "That was not his name. Natasha gave you something to prove, and part of that is on me." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have just talked to you." "Yes. I was afraid you'd say no, and that would be the end of it." "I might have said no," I said, "but I would have heard you. We did not fix everything at that kitchen table. You cannot fix years in an afternoon, but we started. The way you start anything worth having, which is imperfectly and with the full understanding that you will have to keep starting over and over until it holds. If you have watched this far, then you have stayed with me through something I could not have anticipated and would not have chosen. I want to tell you what I actually learned, because I think it is different from what people expect me to say. People expect me to say, "Be careful with your estate planning. Verify who has access to your medical records. Know your rights under the Substitute Decisions Act." All of that is true. Please know those things. The Canadian Centre for Elder Law and the Advocacy Centre for the Elderly both have resources, and they are worth your time. But that is not the deepest thing I learned. The deepest thing I learned is this. I made a son feel invisible while building something in his father's memory. I was so certain I was protecting Gerald's legacy that I did not notice how lonely Daniel had become inside it. That loneliness did not cause him to make good decisions, but it is part of the story, and I am part of that. You can be completely in the right legally and still have something to answer for. I chose ambition when I should have chosen presence, not every time, but often enough that it left a gap. And gaps, in families as in structures, are where the cold gets in. I still work. I will probably always work, but I leave the office at 5:30 most days now. I call Daniel on Sundays. Last month we drove to Perth for the Gerald planted that oak tree in the backyard the spring Daniel was born. He said he wanted Daniel to grow up knowing that things take time and that patience is not the same as waiting, that some things simply need years to become what they were always going to be. I think about that a lot lately. I think we are still becoming. Thank you for being here with me. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about trust or family, or the cost of building without watching what grows beside you, I would be grateful if you stayed. There is more I want to share. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, please pass it along. You never know which wall someone is standing on the other side of, listening.